Now, the final report of the state capture inquiry seems to be set for a legal challenge after Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo dismissed an application by former spy boss Arthur Fraser to cross-examine witnesses. Now, Zondo said Fraser had failed to follow the most basic of rules for the right to question witnesses who implicated him, including specifying the exact statements he disputed. Instead, the former head of the State Security Agency made a blanket denial of any wrongdoing and deposed 2 unsigned documents to the Commission. News 24 legal journalist Karyn Maughan joins us now to unpack the implications of the ruling. Karyn, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, before we really come to the crux of the matter, one would have thought that Arthur Fraser's application would have given some light, some answers, some clarity when it comes to some of the question marks that still linger. But that was not the case for Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. Well, acting.
I think the crucial thing here to remember is that as yet, from what we heard from the DCJ, Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's ruling yesterday, Arthur Fraser has actually not disclosed any kind of defense to the allegations made against him. Instead, we have seen him, for instance, laying criminal charges against the evidence leaders, against the witnesses who testified against him. He also, in October opposed Zondo being nominated for the Chief Justice position. He has he's also laid professional misconduct charges against some of the evidence leaders. And one of the reasons that he says why he hasn't given a full and substantive account of his response to the very serious allegations made against him by a number of witnesses is because he claimed that he needed access to 41 classified files or documents from the State Security Agency. But it emerges in Zondo's ruling yesterday that the SSA had actually agreed to enable him to access those documents so that he could mount a defense under the prescripts of the law. And he simply didn't take that opportunity. So, one has to wonder in light of that if Arthur Fraser was in fact serious about putting his evidence across, or if, as some legal pundits have suggested, this application was really about casting a long legal shadow over the future, imminent state capture inquiry report, and his contention that he will no doubt make that he wasn't given a fair right to respond to it.
Does the Commission then perhaps run a risk of losing out on some crucial leads and, weighing out what sort of implications this could have had those processes been followed by Arthur Fraser?
I think the thing is, Paul, we have seen this playbook before. We saw it with former President Jacob Zuma. Probably some of the most, serious and relevant information that could have been accessed by the Commission would have come from the former president. It was during his 9 years in office that, the Commission is effectively investigating this so-called parallel administration. So, state capture by private entities and families of whole swathes of government. Jacob Zuma, like Arthur Fraser, very much coming after the inquiry, questioning its legitimacy, questioning its bias, and ultimately choosing not to go and answer questions that didn't incriminate him directly in crime, and as we know, ending up in prison. So this isn't something that we haven't seen before at the Commission. Obviously, we have seen a great deal of very detailed evidence as a result of the high-level panel report that was conducted by Dr. Sidney Mufamadi. We have seen a lot of state capture, state security agencies, staff, current and former, giving evidence about so-called state capture at the agency. So I think that the inquiry does have a sense of what the serious issues within that structure were. There's very likely, I agree with you, to be a potential legal challenge in the future against the report. But I think given that, Zondo outlined very, very painstakingly in what could possibly have been his longest ruling in the inquiry so far, how the Commission had done everything it could to get Arthur Fraser's evidence under oath about what had actually happened, I'm not sure that that kind of challenge will actually be successful.
And what essentially underpins the integrity and the credibility of the Commission, especially as this report is soon going to be unveiled?
Well, I think the thing is that, ultimately there is an expectation that there will potentially be legal challenges to the report. But the report is really, it's something that is going to be given to President Cyril Ramaphosa. He must then make a decision about what he does with it. We already know, for example, that there has been, changes to the regulations to enable the state capture inquiry to share information, to share evidence, to interact with the prosecuting authority in terms of building cases. Some of those cases are currently in court. For example, the asbestos matter, in which the suspended ANC Secretary General Ace Magashule is an implicated party. There are a lot of different, in relation to Trillian, McKinsey, Eskom, there are cases in court at the moment. And so in many respects, whether the report is challenged or not, the evidence that it has uncovered is still very much in play. So, whether adverse findings are made against people, ultimately it's going to be up to the prosecuting authority, law enforcement, professional conduct bodies, and other entities to take the findings and recommendations further. I think the interesting point may be what Zondo says in relation to the State Security Agency, which has long since been the subject of investigation, for many years, and of course that high-level panel report. Is he going to suggest that significant reforms within its structures are important? Because that kind of thing could then potentially be the subject of legal challenge, albeit I'm not sure that challenge may end up being successful.
We know that the role of the Commission is not to essentially find anyone guilty, but to make recommendations like you perhaps are suggesting. And you speak about some of the entities. I mean, the National Prosecuting Authority has really come under fire recently with questions being asked about why they're not making those moves and following up on those high-profile cases. And we know that on Monday, NPA head Shamila Batohi will be addressing the media in the midst of all these questions being raised. What do you imagine some of those responses to be when it comes to the inaction that she's been accused of?
I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, law enforcement agencies, whether it was the Hawks, even SARS to a degree, the National Prosecuting Authority, were very much, hollowed out, I think is the term that's been used during the era of state capture. And that was a very deliberate strategy to ensure that people were not held accountable. And so many of the people who are very seriously implicated in nefarious activities, potential incompetence, corruption, are still in those positions. We haven't seen a major, purge of allegedly problematic individuals from the NPA. So, that's an obvious question to ask. Is we know there's evidence on the table about conduct that was really problematic and at very best highly unprofessional, which hasn't been dealt with by the NPA. And we also know that, there are a number of these cases where, for instance, the Brian Hlongwa matter has been, no movement has been made on that case for 10 years. There are other cases. There have been recent movements, for example, in the prosecution of the former Minister Batabile Dlamini, but there are still question marks over why the NPA didn't act when Jacob Zuma walked out of the commission and showed contempt for the inquiry, alleged contempt, in November 2019, 2020. So why was action not taken? People will obviously, that the NPA has come out consistently and said it's trying to rebuild, it's trying to restructure. But given that Shamila Batohi, when she came into office, promised to deal with the so-called cancer of impunity, and very little has happened subsequent to that, I think she is going to face some very tough questions about why the NPA, and her in particular, has seemingly failed to deliver on the promises that she made when she took office.
Absolutely, very well. Thank you so much, News 24 legal journalist Karyn Maughan, answering some of those questions when it comes to Arthur Fraser and, of course, Acting Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's outcome to the application that he posed and put forward.